Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Alicia Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of Dyslexia Canada. And thank you for joining today's presentation about building a dyslexia-friendly classroom or dyslexia awareness for teachers. I'm very excited and grateful to be able to introduce today's presenter, Sarah Cassidy. Sarah is a special assignment teacher with the Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic District School Board. She has over 18 years of experience in education. She has taught everything from kindergarten to grade 6 and has served students and families as a special education resource teacher as well. Sarah is now an instructional coach who helps to promote and support educators with the application of the science of reading in ways that make sense for the students in each classroom. She is passionate about equity and inclusive education and self-regulation and believes in promoting the gifts and talents of each student first and foremost. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. And I would like to say before we get started, if you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the question and answer function at the bottom, and I'll be happy to ask Sarah those questions at the end of the presentation. And you're also welcome to use the chat function during the webinar. So Sarah, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alicia. I am so excited to be here tonight to discuss some of the things that I've learned over the years that I think can help support families and educators to work together as a team when they're thinking about the best possible way to support students who have dyslexia. And I'm also really humbled this month in particular to be here with Dyslexia Canada during Dyslexia Awareness Month. I really appreciate all of the work that Dyslexia Canada does in support of families and in building awareness and education around this topic in a really nice way that it provides a roadmap for so many of us to follow. So I'm always really appreciative of their work and was really humbled to be asked to share with you tonight. The first question before we get going is really a question about semantics. What is dyslexia? What does it mean? Oftentimes we hear it used as a blanket term, and there's a lot of confusion about the term and what it means and how it applies to children's ability to read, to write, to spell, and sometimes do math. And that's another piece that a lot of people don't know, is that sometimes with dyslexia, there are some components of math. However, where we start to see most of the indicators and the visible signs and the characteristics that might give us a sense that there is something we need to look further into, it really is in the language pieces. That's the most prevalent. We start to notice signs of difficulty in oral language, in expressive and in receptive. We start to notice language difficulties in decoding and in spelling and in written language and in output. So because dyslexia is not in isolation, a lot of the time it exists because we are complex humans. It impacts the way that information is processed and it's stored in our brains and it's retrieved when we need it. And so we can also see an impact on memory and the speed of processing. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that we are not able to learn to read, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, but it really is about the speed at which the processing happens, and the intervention works on how we can help support that piece. Dyslexia is really about neurodiversity, it's about genetics, and it's about opportunities. And children with dyslexia, they have brains that process language learning differently. We all have different brains, and this is one way that we have neurodiversity. Oftentimes it does run in families, as is the case with my family. And there's nothing that anybody can do to prevent it or to cause it. And so that's a really important piece as well. And it's not something that you would cure. But what we do know is that early identification and early intervention with specialized instruction that's really focused on exactly what the kids need at just the right moment will really help children to be successful when they're learning to read and write and alleviate the stress and the characteristics that often accompany a diagnosis of a learning disability or of dyslexia. And when we alleviate the stress and we help promote success, we really have the power as educators and as parents working together or families working together to have huge implications for life outcomes for kids. And that's why we see this as an equity issue first and foremost. And we'll get into some of those pieces as we go along. but it impacts more students than we actually think. And if we look at the prevalence on the right-hand side of the screen, see, that's another piece of my dyslexia. I have to like say which is left and right still, and I'm like old, so I should know this by now, but that's a little processing thing that still happens for me. We intentionally have to plan for students. If we look in every classroom, there could be 2 to 4 children in every single Canadian classroom that have dyslexia. And that's big. That's actually a pretty big percentage. And then some people would say, well, it's only 2 to 4 children in every classroom. I'm not going to change everything that I do for 2 to 4 children. And I would challenge and push back on that. Because what we know is that it impacts more students than we think. There are lots of students who get lost and fall like between the cracks. And intentionally planning for those 2 to 4 children in every single classroom when you're planning your literacy instruction will never disadvantage other students who don't have the same learner profile. In fact, it makes their learner profile more effective and efficient and gives them the language for the reading pieces that they need. But what is really important is that for these 2 to 4 kids in every classroom is absolutely essential for closing the gap for them. So when we're thinking about just in terms of educator stress, like thinking about if I can do this as tier 1 and I can do this really well as tier 1, it's not going to harm anyone, but it's going to be essential and possibly change a life for a student that needs it most. The term for dyslexia, and this is one of the things that we've been discussing in our board with board psychologists and speech and language paths, and really trying to help people understand. It's the label piece, but it's really about definitions and really helping families understand, because remember, we also talked about how it runs in families, and dyslexia can run in family, learning disabilities can run in families. And so you may be having a conversation with a family or a parent who didn't understand this about themselves growing up. And so the conversation that you have when you're having this discussion is actually quite important. One of the pieces for this is that we don't generally see the term dyslexia used in clinical psychology reports or speech and language reports for our school board, at least. And there are a variety of different reasons for that. And so we may see other terms like learning disability or specific learning impairment with communication or language impairment. There's a variety of different terms. Dyslexia really, it is used to encompass a lot of variety of learning disabilities. But really it's about that problem with the decoding and the spelling. Can they take the pieces of the code and use it to read the words and figure out how to encode or how to spell those words? And that is the piece of dyslexia where we really want to make sure people understand that piece. Dyslexia versus learning disability, and this is this graphic in particular will help illustrate that even though we're talking about learning disability versus dyslexia, we want people to understand that dyslexia is the most common learning disability. 80% of the individuals with a learning disability have dyslexia. However, not everybody with a learning disability has dyslexia, and not everybody with dyslexia will meet the current legal definition. And so part of the confusion is that we have kids who, because of IQ or because of cultural differences, won't fall under the category to really identify as a learning disability. And so when we're looking at decoding and we're looking at spelling, we're thinking about the dyslexia piece. When we're thinking about the simple view of reading, decoding is that first part, and then we think about the comprehension, so the language comprehension. And so you may have problems with language comprehension as well and still be dyslexic, but it may not be a learning disability. I think the important thing to remember here is that labels are never actually the most important thing that we're talking about when we're talking about humans, as a rule in my life. And what we really need to be focusing on is that whether you have a dyslexia or a learning disability or both, that this intervention, structured literacy, and the really specific intervention helps all kids. And so I don't want to get hung up on numbers and thresholds and all of those things, but we're not really looking at the label. There is no one size fits all for complex humans, and the person will always matter more than the diagnosis or the label. So this leads us into further clarifying the myths and the facts that are out there about dyslexia right now. This graphic, I really like this one from the National Center on Improving Literacy, and it's a great little graphic that can help separate fact from fiction, if you will. And another thing that really helps parents when you're having this conversation, you just want to have these things at your fingertips. So you can download the graphic on the website, and it's just a really nice way to kind of get rid of what's actually true and what people's perceptions are about dyslexia. So let's jump into it and break it down a bit more. So dyslexia, as I mentioned before, is all about neurodiversity. There's no one size fits all approach for everybody who has dyslexia. No one was born being able to read and write. You didn't pop out of the womb just picking up a book and putting a pencil in your hand and writing. And every single person acquires the skills that they need and those basic building blocks for literacy at their own rate. We can start to notice patterns and clusters of characteristics of students as they're exposed to formal learning, language learning opportunities. But different skills are going to develop at different rates for every child. And so it's really important, whenever we're talking about neurodiversity, we're always thinking about a continuum. It's not a, yep, that person has all of these markers, and so they definitely have dyslexia, and it doesn't work like that. The second one, and this is a really interesting one for anyone who is following the science of reading in any capacity, and it's caused boards to really have to re-examine what they know about how kids actually learn to read. Reading is not about memorizing words that we encounter by sight. Sight words or word lists that we memorize, that's not how we learn to read. If that was the case, then we would all have to memorize every word in the English language as a whole word. And if we think about how inefficient that would be as a strategy, let alone the amount of storage we would need in our brain in order to do that, it's kind of mind-boggling. Children without dyslexia or learning disabilities, they're able to automatically process and notice patterns that exist in language in a way that we can't actually see happening because we can't see what's going on in their brains. But they see the patterns and they start to put those pieces together. They're not actually memorizing the whole word by sight, even though it might look that way. Their brain is doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes to manipulate sounds, to put them together. And with a child with dyslexia, we just need a lot more repetitions and practice to get to that piece of automaticity. It starts with hearing the sounds and being able to manipulate them and then access that information when you need to apply it for reading and decoding and spelling. And although I do always want in kindergarten, as a kindergarten teacher, I would always want to say, like, how has your eyesight been checked? And for sure, I want to know if they can see. I don't know if they can transfer when they're starting to link the phoneme and the grapheme together, they have to be able to see. So it's not about dismissing eyesight, but it's just saying that it isn't the eyesight that is the problem or the vision that's making it hard for them to learn to read. This one, people with dyslexia cannot learn to read. I'm here and I know how to read. So yes, you can learn to read and you can learn to spell. Does it take more work and practice and really intentional and intensive instruction? It absolutely does. But I have myself and my 2 children to demonstrate that it is possible to learn to read and to thrive and to feel okay about it and to understand the gifts that it brings you as well with your neurodiversity. So you will learn to read. You just have to, it will take a lot of really intensive work and really purposeful planning. Okay, this one, let's talk about brilliance here for a minute. This one is a bit tricky to understand sometimes, but dyslexia has nothing to do with being intelligent. It has nothing to do with your intelligence at all. And so, for example, when we first were talking to our kids about learning disability diagnosis, I said to them, you have a learning disability and you don't get that unless you're smart. And that's like the truth. You have to have, you have to be like this smart, and then your academics, like there's something blocking you from showing how smart you are. And that's really all we're talking about here. And so it doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. And it just means that your brain is different and it processes things. And there are some things that are preventing you from getting this encoding and decoding skill. But that's why we do things differently, because you are smart. And we do things differently because we know that we have to get that brilliance out and share your gift with the world. And that's what's most important. So we accommodate, and we put accommodations in, and we use structured literacy, and we provide assistive technology when necessary. And we provide many, many opportunities to practice the skills that need to be practiced. And we do whatever it takes to help kids shine and show the ways that they are smart and the gifts that they do have to share with the world. This piece in particular is a really important point, as many school boards are jumping on the phonological and phonemic awareness train in really important ways that I have never seen in all of my years of teaching. Just this like kind of really paying attention to these pieces and assessing them and planning with them in mind and fitting them in multiple opportunities in the day. However, we do have to remember, I feel like I'm a broken record, no one size fits all, but phonological and phonemic awareness are only a piece of the pie when we're talking about science of reading and structured literacy. They're an important piece of the pie, but they are only one piece of the pie. And so we will have kids who do fine on some of those early screeners looking at phonological and phonemic awareness for a variety of different reasons. And I often talk about my son. My mom was a kindergarten teacher who believed in all of this, and obviously she worked with me when I was young. And so Rafi and Sharon Lewis and Bram and all of these phonological and phonemic awareness, what they were happening in utero for my kids. And so those pieces were well established, but like there were other pieces with the phonics and the blending that were a little bit stickier. So we don't just want to say that every student who doesn't do well on phonological with phonological processing, we have to also look at all of the other pieces and really try to think specifically about where are the roadblocks and how do we overcome those, and not make an assumption about one piece of it has to be bad in order for it to be defined as dyslexia. And also just remembering that neurodiversity means different strengths and areas and growth. And that means no one is going to look the same. They're not going to have the same profile. And it's really important to always come back to that. In the same vein, just like there's no single tool that's going to help you identify and process exactly what the problems are, there's no one size fits all program that will get every child to where they need to be. And structured literacy or science of reading, they're not programs. We're not teaching curriculum, we're teaching children, and we're teaching amazing and diverse children. And so that can never be lost in the discussion. We need to be really great kid watchers and pay attention to the parts of the instruction that are working well for the child. What are the things that you're seeing they're growing really quickly in, and what are they not moving at all on? And then you start to adjust based on the knowledge that you have. And so this helps us getting closer to understanding what will work in particular for that child, because if somebody says they're doing the science of reading because they bought a program, your spidey senses should be tingling. There's no one program that knows what every single child needs. And it really does fall on us to be discerning about the program, but then also when you're delivering it, you have to be watching the kids, and you have to be watching and paying attention and checking back in and reassessing as you go, because there is no one size fits all. And finally, there is no program or silver bullet. I wish I could say that it was, but because we're complex, there isn't, and I actually prefer it that way. But what I will say is that the silver bullet is really screen all the kids, use the structured literacy for all students in tier 1, do a really explicit daily structured build on it every single day. and then provide additional and daily intervention and practice opportunities for those who could be at risk, and then continue to circle back and help them grow. And so this is the other piece that I think right now, as an instructional coach, I often get mailers all the time. Here's this new program that aligns with the science of reading, and it has picked out like quite a few buzzwords. And so we did a session last week where we were getting people to think about, okay, how would you actually use this? Does it actually make sense for the kids in your class? And how are you going to be really critical about that as an educator? It may look pretty, and it may have emojis, and it may have all these other things that you think are going to grab kids, but really you are the strategy. And Susan Hopkins says that all the time, you are the strategy. So you watch and you see and you put those things in place. You don't need a program necessarily. It's easier some things, like if you can buy some components, absolutely, but really thinking about what do you need help with to make your life easier, and then what is actually going to make your life harder, because you now have to manage all of the pieces of a new program and figure out, is that actually what makes sense for your kids? So the next thing, just about the name is a dyslexia-friendly classroom, and you'll see some of the other hats that I wear come out in the rest of this presentation. How do we talk to kids about dyslexia? And the first thing is we have to talk to kids about dyslexia. We have to, and not just kids who have dyslexia. We have to talk to all kids about dyslexia, and we have to talk to families about dyslexia, and we have to say it in a way that gives hope and is asset-based, so that there's not like a sense of grieving or sadness, because the kids are still amazing and they're still going to do amazing things. It just means that we are going to help create this culture that supports that child through the whole way, and then helps them advocate for themselves. So the first step is really that we have to teach them about what's happening in their brain. They have to know what's going on. They have to know that no one is born with the ability to read, and that reading develops differently in all of us, in the exact same way that sometimes it takes some kids longer to learn to walk, some kids longer to learn to crawl. We all develop different skills at a different pace, and that's okay. We just say that, you know, if you're someone who, say, is struggling to walk, then you continue to practice it. You practice and practice and practice, and you need more focused practice on it. It doesn't say, well, we've just given up, you'll never learn to walk, so here we go, and we're done with that. And I think we do it in all kinds of areas. We just continue to go back and give multiple opportunities, and that's the message that we also need to be sending to kids, is that you are going to learn to read, and we're going to make sure, and these are the things we're going to do, because this is how your brain works. And when we're explaining this to kids, we have to consider developmental age, and we have to always consider engagement. We have to, you know, there's this example here from this, it's Yale Dyslexia, talking with your child about dyslexia, and so there's a live link there that you can check, and this quote came from there. And so she talks about when her son was diagnosed, he was really into like big machinery, and explained, then took what he was into and explained what was happening in his brain in terms of what made sense to him and what the developmental age is. And so the quote that she used over there I thought was brilliant, and you can think about it for anything. My daughter's into riding, so I'd use the analogy of the horseback riding jumps, and where some of them are higher and you have to work harder, and some of them are easier. And so figuring out who is that kid as a person and what makes them tick and what's going to make sense to them when you're having this conversation is really important. I also want to reinforce that idea that it's an obstacle but not a permanent wall. And so the backhoe loader that can move the rocks out of the way shows that it's an obstacle. The jumps for my daughter to jump over when she's horseback riding is an obstacle. It's not a permanent wall. And that, you know, you're going to learn to read. There's lots of science that teaches ways to help, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with the science, and we're going to try some things, and you're going to be part of this too, and let us know what's happening and what works for us, and we're going to be a part of this team, and we're going to move these obstacles together. The other piece, and so this is my children, The other piece is that we really do have to figure out ways to help kids shine. Because learning to read, because of the value that we place on literacy and language acquisition, and because of how it opens up the world, that's why we want kids to learn to read. But kids do know when they're struggling, and they do know when things are difficult. And so we have to really start to help them see themselves beyond this one thing that they're struggling with. And how do we give them opportunities to really make sure that they are able to shine and be their authentic selves and have something outside that they're good at that is not just all about what I can't do. And so art or sports or nature or cooking or baking or something, anything that they can do that makes them feel good, fills them up, and wraps them in love along with it, because they're doing it in community and they have something to be proud of. This is really important for me for an equity point of view, and also in terms of us really matching what we say with what the class culture is. And it's really putting your money where your mouth is in so many ways. And so I want us to be really asking these hard questions about how and where students see themselves reflected in the class or in the school or in the world, and what that narrative is. And we have conversations all the time about students need to see themselves reflected back to them in meaningful ways and in positive ways. And so that's why we bring in picture books and have really, really rich read alouds that highlight brilliance of other cultures, languages, different family structures. So we do all of those things intentionally. And I want us to also have that same mindset when it comes to thinking about learning disabilities or dyslexia. How are students seeing themselves reflected in the class? Are they? And if they are, great. Is it in a positive way that gives them hope and inspires them and empowers them? Or is it in a way that creates this like, oh, poor me, so-and-so can't learn to read, isn't that sad? That's not what this is about. And so sometimes our body language and our tone of voice and the decisions that we make, or not making decisions, can also communicate that really, really clearly. And so I do want to challenge us that not just in October, in the same when it's Dyslexia Awareness Month, in the same way that we're not just going to celebrate Black Canadians in February or Indigenous cultures in June. We need to figure out how to do this every single day, and think about what are the books that we can bring into our classroom libraries and our read alouds when we're doing those other pieces of structured literacy, those really rich and important pieces that really celebrate and affirm every identity in your classroom. Because in the end, you really want your classroom to be one that affirms every single person's identity. And so the representation, it does matter for sure, but you also have to be always keeping it in the forefront so that it's something that a child doesn't just get to see it once a year. And the other piece is really about keeping the expectations of success as high as you possibly can. So when we're thinking about classroom culture, there are things that are going to take students longer. There are. If you have a language processing delays or barriers or gaps, it's going to take you longer. Does that mean we just take away the opportunity for you to practice those skills when really that's what you need most? So I would never say to a child, well, someone else can read that for you because you can't read. You're taking away an opportunity for them to do exactly what we need them to do. And so this piece about UDL, because when we're coming out of Teachers College or pre-service courses, there's a lot of talk about universal design for learning. And I do just want to talk a minute about that piece, because we do want to universally design learning to help support these students first. And we talked about that. But when we're going too quickly to assistive technology or taking away opportunities to actually practice reading, decoding, spelling, the things that they need the extra practice in, is that really an environment that is designing for success? So some of the accommodations or some of the things that we really think about for UDL, it makes it easier to access content. And I don't ever want to take that away. I think we need to think about that, but be really strategic. But universally designing for learning doesn't mean taking away every opportunity for students to practice the skills that they need the most. I also want there to be celebration and studies and studying on people that kids are invested in. I talk to my kids when I put these pictures up, and they were like, "Oh, you're so old. Like, I don't know who any of these people are. Why do I care?" Except Top Gun came up, so they know about Tom Cruise. But really thinking about, who are these people? What have they done? And then what are you capable of? That's the world reflected back to them. And thinking about the opportunities and the things that made people great. And also really thinking about the books that support reading, the decodable texts that are high interest, and books that are designed to help kids feel successful. All of those things are creating this classroom culture that really supports and wraps around kids. So when you are being reflective, because really that's what we are as educators and as families, always trying to think about, how can I do this better? We don't teach the same way or the same content or anything year after year, because we don't have the same kids in front of us. So it wouldn't make sense. But if you're going to really sit down and think about, when you're thinking about your classroom culture, ask yourself these questions and be honest with yourselves and challenge yourselves. What do you truly believe about the capabilities of students with dyslexia? Is there an unconscious bias that comes into your head that says learning disability, less capable? Is there something that comes in where you automatically start to expect less of a student because of a learning disability, when the learning disability, for example, means that they are quite capable if accommodated for and supported properly? What limitations are you unintentionally placing on students through accommodations? So when you're offering accommodations, it's kind of, it's this parenting thing. My kids are like, "Oh, that's too hard. I don't want to do it." Well, sometimes life is hard. And we talk about grit and we talk about perseverance. And sometimes it's easier just to do the thing and give them the thing, or let them away with the thing. But in the long term, when we're thinking about the kids that we are trying to form and raise and have go into the world and function as global citizens, we need them to be able to try hard things. And so when you're doing accommodations, are you actually taking away opportunities for them to practice? Are you sending a message about learned helplessness? Are you sending a message to them about, if it's too hard, we don't do it? Because you can learn to read and it is hard. Those two things have to exist in the same sentence, but I know you can do hard things. So we don't take that away either. The other piece, and this is like, really talking about voice and choice, which I know are buzzwords, and we're talking about them all the time. And in our literacy blocks, when we do discussion circles and we do all of these rich comprehension strategies, and we talk about vocabulary, and we share our thinking, and we respond respectfully, all of these things that we're doing as part of our literacy programs, have we ever asked the students how they feel about the support? How is this going for you? Do you feel like I am singling you out? Do you feel like I am taking away an opportunity from you that is something that you could do? And then I also want us to really kind of push back. We're thinking a lot about decolonizing education, and what are the strengths that the education system values above all else? And I often share this example. This is like a little confession on a webinar, but I was terrible at art, but it didn't seem to matter because art was never really something that the high school that I went to in particular, it wasn't like it was of a huge value. So I could be terrible at art, and I could get my friend to do my art homework on the bus on the way to school. And it was never, because it wasn't, the education system didn't seem to value it. And so we all place a lot of pressure on literacy and numeracy, and they are really, really important. But how are you also really helping kids shine if they're struggling with those traditionally valuable educational skills? How are you really making sure that if art is every Friday, how do you make sure they have opportunities if they're someone who really thrives at art, so that they don't just get to feel good about themselves on Friday? And then how are you investing in their success while still honoring exactly who they are? Is there an identity? Is it an identity affirming classroom that whoever you are is perfectly okay, and we're all in it together, and we're all learning together, we're all going at different paces, and we're here to support each other as a classroom community or a family? So the other piece, and this was one, having conversations with families. As a kindergarten educator or as a special education teacher, sometimes I was the first one to have a conversation with a family member that kind of gave them a sense that there was something that was going on that wasn't quite, that I was a bit concerned about, or that I thought we need to be on top of. And I want to be really clear, we as educators, we don't diagnose. We're not doctors, we're not qualified to do that. Really, we are working with families because they are the experts on their kids, and we're bringing forward the concerns that we're seeing and also giving them hope. So it's not just like we're dropping all of the concerns on them and then moving on. So the first thing, and this I think is just like good practice, the first thing I want to know is, do you like my kid? Do you care about my kid? And how are you going to communicate that in the first sentence? I really, really care about your son, your daughter, your child. I really care about them. And I'm seeing these things that are making me a bit concerned. I need your help. And that goes into the next one. I need your help. If a kid is in kindergarten and I'm starting to get a bit concerned, I can say, you've known them 5 years, I've known them 5 minutes, I need your help. So I need to understand what you're seeing. We need to come at this together. And that piece of humility is really, really critical. And humility without defensiveness, which I know is later on in the slide. But if a parent comes to you and says, I'm concerned about their child, they're really just concerned about their child. They're not necessarily concerned about you as an educator, or you like, it's not about you. They bring their children to us full of like hope, and if they're coming to us with a concern, it is important that we pay attention to that piece, and we really focus on saying, okay, let me see, and then I'll see what I'm doing, and then we'll work on this together. It's not about defensiveness and shutting things down, and being open to trying something new, or saying, I don't know the answer, which is perfectly fine, but I'm going to find the answer, and I'm going to figure it out. And don't worry, we're not going to let things like fall. Sharing what you've noticed is really important, and that goes back to being just a really good kid watcher, but also collecting the data that you need to collect. If it is on phonological and phonemic awareness, what's the data that you have, and what have you noticed when you've been trying to do that daily practice in tier 1? What are the things that are working? What isn't working? And make sure it's up to date, and that you've had some time to sit with them and really check in about those pieces, and communicating that piece about, we're in this together no matter what, and it's going to be great, and we're going to figure it out, and I don't have all the answers and you don't have all the answers, but we'll do this together. We have to be fiercely protective of that. We see that kids are checking out and families are checking out earlier and earlier, and we really do need to come at this as a team approach. And the last thing is that you educate yourself on the science of reading. What makes it easier to have these conversations is that you have done some of the learning and you've done some of the work. And that is also how you communicate hope and reassurance, because you can then say to a family member, okay, I've been doing this reading and I have, the science is really promising for this. So are you willing to try this with me? And then we'll come back and we'll check back in again in 6 weeks, and we'll see if what we did made a difference. and just like really communicating that plan, that you have a plan, is sometimes just the most reassuring thing you can ever say to a parent. What does it mean when I say educate yourself on the science of reading? And so there's all kinds of, webinars and courses, and, be discerning about those too. Alicia has done some great work with IDA. And so there's some really great courses out there that really help with the science of reading, and some really great books. The first thing is that you just really have to learn which assessments are evidence-based, and practice delivering them and collecting that data and doing it with fidelity, and making sure you're saying the sounds properly, and making sure you're clipping the schwa when you need to, and making sure all of those pieces are in, so that when you're sitting down to talk to families, you have accurate data in front of you that helps you inform the conversation, but inform your planning. And then the next step is that you use the data and you plan that targeted intervention, and then you really try the intervention that you planned and watch carefully, make sure that it aligns with the science of reading, and that it aligns with the specific roadblocks that the student is experiencing. And then the other piece is that sometimes this goes outside the classroom. This goes outside the purview of the classroom. It goes outside, and you may need to have a request for a deeper assessment. And so learning about the pathways and the timelines for further testing and for appropriate support when it goes to tier 2 or it goes to tier 3, and being able to be really clear with parents, like, we can put them on a list, but here are the options. This is how long it will take. And I think the most important piece about that is that putting them on a list for a psych assessment, or putting them on a referral, is not the work. And so you're communicating to parents that you're not sitting there doing nothing while you're waiting for the name to come up on the list. These are the things that we're doing in the meantime while we're waiting, and then we'll have more information to give the psychologist or the speech and language pathologist when they come in, because we've done all of these pieces. And so the sitting and the waiting is not the work, and we're not stopping it there. The referral is not the work. And then we also need to learn about the child as a whole. If there is a child who needs a certain hook or really struggles with something, we're going to take those considerations in, because educating yourself on the science of reading only goes so far if you're not also getting to know your learners and really focusing on the learner profiles of the kids in front of you. So the plan of action that you're also going to communicate to families is, you talk about the pieces of the science of reading. You talk about the different pieces of the pie, and you figure out where exactly you think the problem is and what might work. But you also let them know that you know their child, and that you ask for their advice about what do you think a hook would be? Who's a character that they're really into? Or what's something that they love that I can find a decodable text that will tie into that desire to read? Then you really communicate how the instruction at school will be targeted, multisensory, systematic, and geared to the child's needs. So when you go and speak to a parent, they need to know that you are not just going to wait and see, as I mentioned on the previous slide, but that you're going to be saying, here's what I'm doing at school every single day to make sure that we're moving along. And I'm going to say, and you know what, we might have this person come in. It may be a yard supervisor who has an extra 10 minutes. It may be the special education teacher. It may be an EA. It may be an early childhood educator, maybe an administrator, maybe a volunteer, but communicating that this is the plan and these are all the things you're going to be doing, because this is really hard work. And parents are going to want to support at home. And we're going to talk a little bit about that piece later on. So being really clear about ways that families can do it that are not going to help kids, like force kids to shut down. What are they going to do at home that's going to supplement, that's keeping things light and fun? Because when they're at school, they're working really, really hard. And then they have to go home and then do some really, really hard things all over when they don't have the gas in the tank to do that. And that can start to create this like fighting against an aversion to reading, and we never want to do that. So keeping it light, helping it, like the activities should be fun and help families connect. And they shouldn't be work, and they shouldn't have to be going out to buy a whole bunch of things necessarily. You could provide code packs and games and all of these other things. But really the goal is that you are reassuring them that they can do the fun stuff at home and keep it light, because you're doing exactly what you should be doing in school. So you're making sure that the intervention and exactly what you're doing is what the kid needs. And so then that gives them the freedom to not have to go home and do all of those really hard things. And then you're going to create this feedback and check-in loop. What have you noticed at home? What have you seen at school? Let's brainstorm again in 6 weeks, and then let's see if we can tweak the plan. The most important thing, and I know I've almost said it probably for every slide, I get that, but you are teaching a whole child, and you never want to forget that piece. You are not teaching just someone with dyslexia. You are teaching a complex, amazing, beautiful, whole person. And that needs to be communicated, that you see the child in that way with every conversation that you ever have with families. So this piece, I do quilt this piece in with Dr. Stuart Shanker's self-reg work on purpose, because I don't think we can have this conversation about the science of reading without talking about stress. And about talking about how when something is hard, there is a problem with energy depletion, and there is a problem with limbic breaking, and there is a need to restore. So if you can think of something, a time in your life where you had to do something and it was really, really hard for you. And then you were like, did it because it was the first time it was so hard for you and you had to do it, and it was like so much cognitive energy spent and burnt all the time. And you're burning that energy all day long. Because if it's reading, and the reading and writing is integrated throughout the day, that's a really hard thing that you have to do all day long. And so you're burning energy. And if you don't have an opportunity or a plan, or if the day isn't structured with the child in mind, we have to start to think as an educator, what is hard for them, and then how do we give them a relief or a chance to have a stress reset, or to put some gas in their tank by mixing up the day and putting things that they love in there. And this is where it becomes more complex than just being difficult at like having a hard time with reading and writing. If I'm also a child who struggles with reading social cues, or if I'm a child who has impulse control, I am burning all kinds of other energy for all kinds of other reasons. And I maybe, have some reading to do, which is really, really hard. And then the teacher says, go outside, run around and have your break. And we see it as a break, but we can't forget that if I'm also someone who struggles with social interactions, that recess is actually really hard for me too. And then I come back inside and somebody says, okay, time to get out your writing. And then that's really hard for me too. And so when we think about hard all the time, we can get to this point where kids get this limbic breaking, where they're just like, enough, I can't do it anymore. And prompting behaviors, or prompting shutdown, or prompting aversion, because they have to go into their glucose stores to get all of that extra energy every single day to do the things that are hard. So when we're planning classroom structures and routines, we may have to change some things for some kids, and we may have to change some things for all kids, because learning can be hard and we have to accommodate for that. We never want kids to shut down. So this is a really important part of this discussion. Shanker has the 5 domains. I put up the picture of the cognitive domain because this is the one that really is probably where most of the stressors are when we're thinking about children with dyslexia or children with learning disabilities. These are things that can be really difficult and burn energy kind of steadily all day long and create tension. And the more tense we are, the more energy we burn. But when we're talking about learning disabilities or dyslexia, it doesn't stay in this one domain. It could interact, it could have social stressors added, like I just talked about with recess. It could create emotional stressors because they have a sense that they're not doing what everyone else is doing. And so they're comparing themselves to other people. And so we really do have to think about the child, and think about how we structure our day and how do we put in opportunities for them to come back and put a little bit of gas in the tank so that they can do the hard work that they need to do in order to fill in some of the gaps and overcome those roadblocks. So how do we plan for that? The considerations for energy depletion and restoration. Ask yourself some of these questions. What are you taking students out of or away from in order to fill the gaps to do the extra practice? And I want us to be like, it's a tough question, and it's one that would make sense. Well, you know, Sarah's really good at art, so I pull her out of art every day to do the reading because she's not so great in that. But what Sarah's feeling is, I'm not great at that, and I get to be not great at that all day, every day. And the one thing that I'm good at, I don't have an opportunity to do. And so what is that doing to Sarah? And we can't forget about that piece as well. How do you structure the day to ensure that the hard tasks are followed by an opportunity to put some gas back in the tank? And that comes from learner profile and knowing your kids and knowing what comes easily for them. So if something comes easily, that's the thing that puts gas in the tank. Like, oh my gosh, I'm successful at this thing. I'm really good at this one thing. And so I have time to feel good about myself and to do something that comes easily. And so thinking about those for those learners, but you can't think of that if you're just doing the structured literacy. You have to think about these pieces for the whole child and their learner profile and what they need and the times of the day that you're seeing they're shutting down or falling apart or just being really tired and disengaged. And then what are you doing an hour before them? And think about those things and what are the opportunities? What time of day are you doing the intervention? If it's in the afternoon when they are really tired, is it as effective as if it would be if it was first thing in the morning or after a first recess or something like that? And I know schedules are different everywhere, but these are just some things to start thinking about and having conversations with as a school team. And then how can you watch for those signs of limbic breaking that can lead to that aversion? So when a child shuts down, and we do this because we want to help them, we want kids to know what they're capable of. So we say, you can do it, and we push them through and we push them through, and then eventually they do push through, but their body has had to go into like stores to pull out energy in order to meet that demand that was placed on them. And the next time they encounter that, they start to have, their body remembers it. So if we do that too many times and push them past the break, that limbic breaking, then every time they encounter some sort of literacy or language activity, you'll see this resistance go up, and kids have to go to the bathroom during that time, and then kids have to get a drink during that time. And so how can we watch for those signs to get ahead of that before it happens? And so that is actually the end of the presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Alicia in a second, but it is a really exciting time right now. So exciting with the Right to Read inquiry, Human Rights Commission, not just for Ontario, structured literacy is on fire. People are upset about it, and there's all these things happening, but they're having the conversation. They're having the conversation, and people are really thinking about what is the most important thing to help kids. And in a tier one, everybody's responsibility as a team way. And I think that's probably one of the most exciting pieces right now in history. This is a really exciting time to be having this conversation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah. And it is a really exciting time. I completely agree. And when I did your introduction, I don't think I gave you enough service and credit in being a part of that team at Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic in Ontario, which is really a board that is paving the way and making some very exciting and very important changes. And I know that you've been a really big part of that. So thank you very much for that.
We're like, I do have to say, I kind of feel this imposter syndrome every time. We're still learning. We're still learning, and we're we're trying things, and we do have a really great team. So I just wanted to, we're all in it together.
Exactly. You're all in it together and everyone is learning, and that's okay. And that's where we need to be. But I see the effort and I see the real commitment on on behalf of your board, which is just amazing to see. And it's so important to have examples like that that we can point to, and show what can be accomplished when people are willing to be open-minded and to be humble and to dig into the learning, and all of that. And I know that you've been a really big part of that. So thank you for that. If anyone has any questions that you'd like to put into the chat, please do that. I'm going to just start in with a question myself. So if a teacher was watching tonight and he or she was interested in reading a book or accessing a resource, is there something specific that you might recommend as a good starting point if they wanted to really dig more into dyslexia?
I think right now, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So I'm just going to put that out there. It's easy to get overwhelmed, and some of the, books that people recommend as like, this is the essential. You have to have the comprehension blueprint, or you have to have like I've got these big stacks of books, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. So I think the one piece, for me is, I think depending on where you're at on the journey, reading Above the Fray is a really easy read if you're just trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together, and also bringing in some of the equity pieces and some of the other pieces. And it's a really nice, it's a fairly easy read, but it just does a really good job of making that piece really clear. And then I think my best advice would be, when you're reading it, just kind of highlight, I don't actually know enough about that piece. I don't know, I can't actually tell you what the difference between phonological and phonemic awareness is. I don't know the difference between those two things and phonics, and be really honest and write those things down. And then those questions and those wonderings, that will lead you to the next piece. There are, I also just have to say, sometimes teachers and educators, they're tired of watching webinars. I know I'm on a webinar, but they're tired of all the things, and you're coming in September, and September's hard, and everybody's tired, and sometimes you just want these really little snippets, or you just want a question. And I've also found, like, some of the Facebook groups, Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in Teachers College, or some of those other pieces, there are some people out there who are doing amazing things and aren't afraid to share, and just really invested in not the credit but the work going forward. And so if you have a question, put it in there. That's your burning question, and you will probably have like 80 responses in the next hour. But it's kind of nice that there's a whole community that's willing to say, here's what I think, and then you can start to put those pieces together, because sometimes it is a lot all at once.
It's true. It's getting started is the hardest part, really. But that's a good. Someone asked for the name of that book again, so it was Reading Above the Fray was the one that you
Reading
recommend?
Above the Fray, yeah. And I'm trying to remember if it's Scholastic. I know I got it on Amazon, and it's pretty new. The thing that I like about it is it introduces the active view of reading. And so we've got the simple view of reading, and then we've got the Scarborough reading rope. And sometimes, depending on when I'm talking to, some people are like, oh, that, like, the simple view is too simple. Like, what is that? Like,
it's not simple though. There's a lot packed in there in both of those domains, when you really start to think about it,
But the active view has all of those things from the simple view and the Scarborough reading rope, but it also takes things into account like self-regulation, and some of the cultural pieces, and really forces us to think about the learner profile, but also really paying attention to what is being absorbed and what's actually being learned when we're teaching. And it forces that piece of just being a really good kid watcher.
Yeah, that's good. Someone wanted to extend that question as well about the resource, and say, is there a resource or a book that you might recommend for school leadership, like something for superintendents or district leaders to read to help them understand? Is there something that comes to mind that was helpful in Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic at all for the leadership team?
So we developed a lot of our own tools because we wanted to have that transparency of, superintendents they're looking for this when they go in, and being really clear that there are a lot of administrators and superintendents who have never taught primary and don't have this. This is new for everyone. So really sitting down with the superintendents and saying, when you go in, do you know what to look for? Do you know what you're not looking for? And a great place to start, we have our own tools now, but a great place to start is the Reading League has the red flags and the green flags. And so if you are, it's not so much a book, I would say reading above the fray even for administrators, because it kind of helps you stay above and gives you the big picture. Because when somebody comes to you and says, I want to buy Haggerty, it's the science of reading, you can be like, okay, wait, that's a piece of the pie, that's not the whole science. And so it gives you a good overview reading above the fray. I do recommend that even for administrators who are just trying to figure out what does this actually mean when I've never taught in a primary classroom and I don't actually know what I'm looking for. But the red flags and the green flag document from the Reading League, and it's free, it's called Curriculum Evaluation Tool. And that is just really helpful in terms of, and not to be used in a punitive way, like you're going in and saying, oh, you have that's on the red flag, but just to start to have a conversation like, I should be seeing more of this, but I'm still seeing this. So how do I really help support my staff in making that switch? And what are the barriers that they're struggling with so that they can make that switch? So from a leadership point of view, I think the most important thing is to be really clear on what it actually looks like, to understand the data pieces, and then ask questions about how they're meeting the data needs. But what you're looking for in the classroom in that curriculum evaluation tool, I think is invaluable. But use it in a supportive way, not in a you're not doing the science of reading way, because there's no one way to do it, but also this is a shift for people. And there's a grieving that goes with this because we always have this sense of we go into education because we want to do what's right for kids. And then we think, oh my gosh, I've been doing everything wrong. And that's not the message with the science of reading. There's tons of things that are still happening in classrooms that are great. But there are certain pieces that we have to rethink of where we have to make sure we're teaching kids to actually read and spell. We're not teaching them to guess. And so if we're teaching kids to guess, we'll see certain things in the classroom, but we also have to support and think of educator stress through this as well. And the educator stress for me is really, I often say to educators who are really they want to do it, but they're working way too hard. They're trying to do all of these different pieces instead of just really sitting down, looking at the data and thinking about, okay, this is what the data is telling me. This is what I need to do. This actually only needs to be 10 or 15 minutes a day. I'm not sitting kids down to practice rhyming for 40 minutes. But for this one chunk, this is what I can do. And here's how I could do it throughout the day. So helping the biggest success we've had is going into classrooms, seeing what their routine is, watching the kids in front of them, and then suggesting some tweaks to what they're already doing and seeing easy ways they can fit this in. But making sure that it's much easier to do this tier one. You're starting this way from the very beginning. It's more work for you if you do it a certain way and then just have to figure out how to pull those other kids to give them what they need. This way of teaching in the tier one is what every kid needs. So give yourself a break and really support the staff in figuring out how to make it easier on them.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that really it's got to be a tier one solution, and then there's layering on top, but it's more it's similar. It's not a different approach where you have one thing happening in the classroom and then something entirely different happening down the road in intervention, for sure. And I see on there that somebody asked for the link to the red flag, green flag, and someone else put it in the chat. So thank you very much to whoever did that. That's great. I see that we're actually at our time. So we're a few minutes over 8 o'clock. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. This was recorded, and we will be putting this on the Dyslexia Canada YouTube channel. So you will be able to access it there. And we will send out a link to that. And we'll also send out a link to the documents and the book, the slides, the red flags, green flags document that Sarah mentioned, and also I'll send out the link to the reading of the Fray book too, if anyone is interested in that. So thank you again, Sarah, for joining us this evening and for your time and for everything that you do, because I really do feel like you guys are leading the way. And it's so nice to be able to have this group of people who are enthusiastic and who are moving forward. And I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for watching tonight, for joining us for this webinar. Dyslexia Canada has quite a number of other webinars coming down the pipe. So I hope that you will stay tuned and join our mailing list and look out for those. In November, we have Dr. Giorgio from the University of Alberta, who is going to be joining us to speak about the work in Alberta. We also have the Martin Family Initiative that is going to come and talk about their Model Schools project on in First Nations communities across Canada. And we have a school from Nova Scotia who will be joining us to talk about implementing evidence-based instruction and assessment in their school and the impact that that's had on their school community. So we're very excited about that. So please stay tuned to Dyslexia Canada, share the information with your friends, and I hope to see you again soon. So good night, everyone. And again, thank you, Sarah.